Good afternoon, everyone. How are you doing? Welcome to Module 9, Standards in Language Learning. Here are our objectives: to comprehend language as an integrative system, and then describe concepts of communicative competence as they are related to language acquisition and development in various school-wide settings. In this module, we're going to relate that to standards. So let's talk about standards a little bit. We're all practicing teachers. We all have some experience with standards. Some of us may hear this word, particularly in the PK through 12 context, and go, holy buckets, standards, boy, the bane of my existence. For me personally, having been a student prior to the standards movement, and being a teacher after the standards movement got started here in the United States, I'm not as opposed to standards as many of my friends and colleagues are. And I'll let you know why as we proceed through this mini lecture. So let's look at the origin story of standards in the United States. So in 1983, this huge report was published called A Nation at Risk. And there was much literature and research to suggest that public schools were lazy and they weren't doing enough to prepare students for future careers and college and being viable, useful members of our communities and our society at large. So there was this huge call for a more rigorous academic curriculum and higher academic standards for public schools. And so, but there was really no follow through. There was really no, what are we going to do? We're going to say to the states, go ahead, increase your academic curriculum standards, the rigor, and increase your standards in public schools. But what are we going to do to support administrators, teachers, schools, staffs, students, parents, and communities? There was a little bit missing there. And in some cases, many of you would suggest there's still a lot of that missing today, particularly here in PA. So let's back this up a little bit here. American educators, as a general rule, have been concerned with educational standards for public school since the common school system was created in the 19th century. We've been asking what students should learn in the schoolroom or in the classroom since early times. And again, when I look at standards now, having been a student, and I'm still a student, I love to learn, and having been a teacher and having worked with content area teachers and administrators, having taught overseas, having different experiences, PK through 12, college, workplace English, I have come for myself personally to value standards. What I don't value is the implementation of the standards and how they're conceived and pushed out to schools, teachers, and other school personnel. In my little tiny bits of experience teaching overseas and then talking to teachers in more European environments and whatnot, to me it feels like those countries have national standards. And because they have national standards, it seems like, at least on paper and in some practice, that there's more concern about the education of the nation as a whole, where it's a privilege, it's not a privilege, it's a right for everyone, regardless of your background. Whereas here, when the standards movement got picked up or started to get picked up in the 1980s, and then the 90s and the early 2000s, there was a lot of discussion and anxiety and even some anger about having a nationalized curriculum making us communist, making us even more behind than we already are. Because how can you bring one national curriculum to 50 different states and protectorates and expect everyone to be on the same page at the same time? And for me personally, standards in many ways is a matter of national security, in the sense of having the whole nation involved in education and having a common idea and a common framework of what should be taught, who should teach it, and what kinds of information should be learned and expected to be learned. Whereas here, in many ways, I still feel that in education is considered an individual privilege and not a right, because our Constitution said anything that the federal government didn't do would be placed upon the states. And if you look at how states developed education over time and space and history, states have always determined who gets to go to school, how they get to go to school, where they get to go to school, what resources that teachers will get, what educational opportunities students will be allowed to have. It's easy to blame the Fed and the government, but overall the federal government really has no say in what happens in your classroom environment. I know that's controversial. Please don't shoot me or hurt me or any of the above. But that being said, we need to think about these things in the context of language acquisition and development. So there are many people who argue that setting higher standards does not necessarily improve educational outcomes, especially without support for teachers and those necessary resources. Darling Hammond, who's actually helped Pennsylvania out quite a bit, has emphasized through her literature and her research that oftentimes higher standards undermine access to education for low achieving students rather than enhancing it, which means in many cases our English language learners PK through 12, and at the college level our international students, so forth and so on. Other researchers like Sheldon and Biddle maintain that really maintaining high standards really entails high-stake tests coupled with rewards and sanctions, which truly deprive teachers and children of the intrinsic motivation and interest in studying the subject matter. Another researcher, Ms. Patricia Graham, points out in her historical studies of teaching standards, in many cases, it's become teaching to the test. And I know many of you, particularly PK through 12, have heard this, and you probably feel like I'm teaching to the test. I'm not teaching to the intrinsic interest of the subject matter at hand. I'm teaching to the test. So how standards are created, how they are implemented, and who creates them are a huge point of distinct contention for many education experts today, particularly here in the United States. So herein lies the sticky wicket. Sticky wicket is a British English term, and it means that something is rather difficult. Comes from the sport of cricket. If any of you have watched it, it's unique. That's all I can say. I haven't watched much of it. But I always like this phrase, sticky wicket, when I think about standards and what it means to me as a teacher and what it means to me as a person who educates people to be teachers. So, when I think of this concept of sticky wicket, I always ask myself these questions, or this big picture question. How do standards help and hinder language development? To be honest, if we really looked at standards, and it's a slog, it's a heavy lift and slog, many of our state standards, particularly content standards, really privilege certain types of language use. There are 4 modalities or 4 domains of language use: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. But if you did a really strong analysis or evaluation of your state standards or whatever standards you use to help you teach, I bet you would come to discover that only certain modalities or domains of language are privileged, leaving out those domains or modalities like listening and speaking that really help and push forward our language learners' ability to develop the second language. So how do standards help and hinder language development? How do they relate to the teaching proposals that we've discovered in our How Languages Are Learned textbook? What about those 18 popular ideas of learning that you'll discover yet again in Chapter 7? How does this relate to the research presented in the text as well as course materials, particularly in the last several, like for individual learner characteristics? What about literacy? What about the other topics that we've studied? And what does this mean for speakers of the second language, in this case English? And what does this mean for teachers and other education providers? So in this week's module, you're going to look at standards in a small way. This is not an exhaustive study of standards. We will be looking at standards in different ways, shapes, and forms throughout the rest of the ESL coursework that you will experience. In this module, I just want you to get a little bit of a taste of how standards help and hinder language development. So you'll look at 2 sets of standards. If you're PK through 12, if you are a PK through 12 teacher, you will look at the WIDA standards. If you're an adult basic education or want to teach adults, you will look at LINC's adult basic education standards. Each of those standards pieces of information will have a video tutorial to further guide you on how to read those standards in the context of the questions that I'm asking you on the assignment that you will do for this module. This will help you set yourself up yet again for the last module in our class that deals with language acquisition, language policies, and language acquisition and development. Thank you for your time and have a blessed rest of the week. Bye-bye.